We'll start today by going over Chapter 14. This is entering our unit on ecology. We'll be covering sections 1, 3 through 4, 7, 14, and 16, so that's what you're responsible for knowing. You should be able to describe what populations are, what population ecology is, know different types of growth, what a life history is and the different types of them, and age pyramids, and how the human population is growing. When I say population ecology, what I'm talking about is the study of how populations interact with their environments. This example here is showing you how ecologists have a challenging task managing natural populations, especially when it's difficult to count the numbers of individuals present or determine how many the environment can support. This is an example with lobsters, which obviously taste delicious. Many people consider lobster as one of the finest delicacies, so it's not surprising that catching and selling them is big business. So imagine for a minute that you were placed in charge of the lobster industry. The 6,000 lobster fishermen in Maine alone depend on your managing the lobster fishery so that not only can they catch and sell enough lobsters to survive throughout the year and earn money for their families, but there must also be enough lobsters left behind to ensure that there are lobsters available to catch in all of the years to come. How do you do it? You would be faced with some tough questions. Question 1 would be, how many lobsters should you allow each fisherman to take each day, or even each year? There's another question would be, should you require that certain lobsters be thrown back? If so, should they be the biggest lobsters or the smallest lobsters? Does it matter whether they are male lobsters or female lobsters? You'd also have to ask, is it best to increase the population size or should it be maintained at the current level? But in addition to these obviously complex questions, you can start with a seemingly simpler one. How many lobsters currently live in the waters off the coast of Maine? Is it even possible to have a reliable count as to what this number is? That's just an example to show you the complexities and the challenge of ecology. These difficult questions are all part of ecology, which again is a subdiscipline of biology that's defined as the study of the interactions between organisms and their environment. Ecology encompasses a very large range of interactions and units of observation and is studied at different levels. Those different levels include the individual, population, communities, and ecosystems. On the individual level, ecology deals with how do individual organisms respond biochemically, physiologically, and behaviorally to their environment. On the population level, it's how do groups of interbreeding individuals change over time in terms of their growth rates, distributions, and genetic makeup. So populations would be groups of the same species living together. And then there's communities. How do the populations of different species within a local population interact with each other? Okay, so communities, you've now added in different species. And then ecosystems, that's the highest level of organization in ecology, which deals with living and non-living elements and how they interact in a particular area, such as a forest, desert, or wetland. Go ahead and answer this question. If we study interactions between lobsters and other local species in Maine, what level of ecology are we studying? The answer is number 3, because we're not only looking at lobsters as individuals, but populations of lobsters and their interactions with other species. So we're looking at communities. The question didn't ask about non-living things, so we're not at the ecosystem level. So we'll explore ecology at all of these levels throughout this chapter and then the next two. We'll focus in this chapter on population ecology, which is a subfield of ecology focusing on populations of organisms within a species and how they interact with the environment. We also examine the special case of human population growth and how it impacts the environment. But you should know those definitions from individual all the way through ecosystem. There is no exception to the rule that every organic being naturally increases at so high a rate that if not destroyed, the earth would soon be covered by the progeny of a single pair. So if left unchecked, any species would continue to reproduce and reproduce and reproduce until they're the only one left. So there's different ways that these populations are regulated so that doesn't happen. In stable populations, we can look at this example with cod. So female cod, over the course of an entire lifetime, lays 5 million eggs. So imagine if we had 5 million babies over one female's lifetime. So how many of those 5 million eggs do you think on average survive and grow to adulthood? You probably didn't say all 5 million, because then we'd be overrun with cod and all of the freshwater lakes and things. The answer is actually just 2. In the case of that, 2 surviving, you have a stable population where the offspring is replacing the parents. So you have 2 parents that make an offspring, right? So you're replacing them directly, so you remain at a constant number of individuals. But what would happen if more than 2 eggs survived of that 5 million? If the number were more than 1 offspring per individual, the population would grow instead of remaining the same, instead of being stable. And it would keep growing and growing and growing until the earth was covered with cod. But that hasn't happened, and it can't. When a population grows at a rate that is proportional to its current size, in other words, the bigger the population, the faster it grows, that growth is called exponential growth. This graph is showing you exponential growth and how very quickly the size of a population growing this way becomes astronomical. In 10 years, this population in this example would have grown from 500 individuals to 2,580, and then in 50 years, it would reach almost 4 million. In fact, after 80 years alone, this population would pass 1 billion. So you can't have continual exponential growth. It ends badly. Go ahead and answer this question. The answer is 5,000. The world isn't overrun with people or cod or elephants or any specific species, so clearly exponential growth does not occur for long. It can occur, but it can't remain on that trajectory. In the next section, we'll talk about why in the real world populations cannot simply grow unchecked. One reason is the environment. Life gets harder for individuals when it gets crowded. Whether you're an insect, a plant, or a small mammal, or a human, difficulties arise in conjunction with increasing competition for limited resources. So if it gets crowded, you have limited resources. Imagine if 90% of our food supply got wiped out tomorrow. There'd be a lot of competition for the remaining 10%, and it might get a little ugly between humans. As population size increases, organisms experience some particular things. One is reduced food supplies due to competition. Another is diminished accessibility to places to live and breed due to competition. Also, increased incidence of parasites and diseases, which can spread more easily when populations are living closer together at higher densities. And increased predation risk as predator populations grow in response to the increased availability of their prey. When a population grows exponentially at first, but then its growth slows as the population size approaches the environment's carrying capacity. The carrying capacity is a limit of resources that are available for a population to survive in. So when a population hits the carrying capacity because of the environmental factors of food supply, housing, etc., they can't grow anymore past the carrying capacity. But once a population is growing exponentially and then hits that carrying capacity, it's called logistic growth. It creates this S-shaped curve. Logistic growth is a much better approximation of how populations grow in the real world. Again, carrying capacity is the population size that the current environment can support. So definitely know the difference between exponential, stable, and logistic growth, and what carrying capacity is and how that relates to logistic growth. There's also density independent factors in your environments that can limit population size. And in an environment with these like bad luck events occurring, a population might never have time to grow as high as the carrying capacity. Instead, it might perpetually be in a state of exponential growth, but then it'll plummet with periodic massive mortality events. You would then see a population growth in these jagged curves. A bad luck event might be like continuous forest fires or continuous drought. So density dependent factors, and we also talked about density independent factors such as those natural calamities or even human caused ones. So now we'll talk about life histories. I want you to think of life histories as strategies for population survival in environments, right? So just like we've seen, there's a large variety of adaptations animals have, of what they eat, of how they look, of where they live. There's also different strategies that populations use to survive in particular environments. So there are different types of life histories. A life history is defined as a sort of executive summary of the vital statistics of the species, including its age at first reproduction, its probability of survival and reproduction at each age, its litter size and frequency, so that means the number of offspring and how frequently they have offspring, and its longevity, which is how long it lives. It tells us about a species as possible, as much about a species as possible based on a small amount of information. So know about these statistics that go into a life history. One of the most important recurring themes in biology is that evolution nearly always finds more than one way to solve a problem, which makes sense, right? Mutations are random, and some mutations will be very different from other mutations, and evolution will then occur when they, through the mechanism of natural selection, adapt that organism to its environment. So there's always multiple ways to solve a problem. For example, as a marsupial mouse, house mouse, and little brown bat, you could take those three different examples, they all live differently, showing you that there's many possible responses to the challenge of when to reproduce, how often to reproduce, how much to reproduce. We'll now talk about the three species I just mentioned, the marsupial mouse, house mouse, and little brown bat. These different types of life histories, we'll talk about three. The first one's Big Bang reproduction. This Australian mouse-sized marsupial are Big Bang reproducers. At 1 year of age, they enter a 2 to 3 week period of intense mating activity for as much as 12 hours at a time. So once they hit 1 year old, they really try and get pregnant. And shortly after that mating period, the males undergo rapid physical deterioration. They lose weight and they pretty much die. So in this species that exhibits Big Bang reproduction, fertility happens really soon and then they die out really fast after they've reduced. Other animals are a bit, but only a bit, more restrained in their reproduction. This house mouse reaches maturity in about 1 month and produces litters of 6 to 10 offspring nearly every month, sometimes generating more than 100 offspring in its first year of life. So we call that fast, intensive reproductive investment. They have a lot of offspring, and they have them pretty early on in their life, but they live longer than the previous example of the Big Bang reproduction. And some animals cannot be farther from Big Bang reproduction. This is the other end of the extreme, the slow, gradual reproductive investment, exhibited by the little brown bat. So the little brown bat is the same size as the mouse. So we're showing you these three different species that are relatively the same size, but they have very different reproductive cycles, different life histories. The little brown bat is mouse-sized, yet it does not reach maturity until 1 year of age. And like that mouse we just saw was at a month. And it typically produces only a single offspring per year, whereas that mouse could have produced up to 100. The advantage that the bat has, however, is that it lives for more than 33 years in its natural habitat. So even though they produce a small number of offspring per year, they live for more years. So again, that's the slow, gradual reproductive investment. So now there's three different types of life histories and how they differ. Life histories vary from the Big Bang reproduction strategy we saw in the marsupial, in which all the material and energetic contribution that an individual will make to its offspring, which is its reproductive investment, it's all made in a single episode, a single reproductive event. And then there are strategies in which organisms have repeated episodes of reproduction, such as humans. Speaking of humans, why do humans defer reproducing so much longer than cats or mice? So let's take the example of the mouse first. So rodents, they're towards the fast extreme of the reproductive strategy. They experience very high mortality rates in the wild, and natural selection has consequently favored early and heavy reproductive investment. Okay, so because they are eaten very quickly in their lives, they die very quickly, they need to have a lot of offspring really fast. That's the mechanism natural selection worked on them in that way. Because they have so many offspring, rodents provide relatively little parental care, so they produce large litters with many offsprings. Organisms with this type of life history tend to have relatively poor competition ability and a high rate of population growth. But even though there's so many offspring, the likelihood of an individual surviving is low. So that mouse might have 100 offspring, but only like 1 or 2 will survive every year to reproduce once they've reached reproductive age. And then at the slow extreme, humans, which have such a low probability of dying in any given year that they can defer reproduction, they can postpone it, and they can reproduce in small amounts once every few years without much risk. All right, so we don't have the risk of dying very young often like these mice do. So we have just one offspring at a time, and we have to invest significant amounts of effort in our offspring to maximize their likelihood of surviving. Mouse offspring can get up and take care of themselves pretty quickly. Ours obviously take a much longer time, so they take a lot more investment, so we have less offspring. Okay, so let's answer this question. Salmon live most of their lives at sea and then return to their natal rivers. That means the rivers where they were born. When they go back to those rivers, they reproduce and immediately die. Which type of reproductive strategy does this exemplify? Pause the video if you need to. The answer is number 1, Big Bang reproduction. So if a species reproduces once and then it dies after reproduction, its goal is just to reproduce that one time and then it dies off, that's going to be a Big Bang reproduction. So the life history is an organism's pattern of growth, reproduction, and survival. And there are different strategies, different life histories that achieve the same outcome, which is having 2 surviving offspring to replace yourselves as parents. But sometimes you're like a salmon, you have the Big Bang sort of approach, and sometimes you're like humans and you have the gradual approach. Next we'll talk about age pyramids in the context of humans specifically, because the human population is growing rapidly. And remember, we talked about exponential growth can't go on forever. With humans, we see that populations often vary across space. What I mean is that the populations are dense in the cities and more sparse in rural areas. If we look at the baby boom, which you've probably heard about, it illustrates that populations have an age distribution as well. Okay, so we're not just distributed geographically and where we live, but we're also distributed in age. Just as there may be more individuals in some areas and fewer in others, there may be more individuals in certain age groups and fewer in others. Describing populations in terms of the proportion of individuals in each age group reveals interesting population features. A population can be divided into the percentage of individuals that are specific age groupings called cohorts. A cohort's just a group. For example, if I wanted to look at the cohort of 0 to 4 years, 5 to 9 years, 10 to 14 years, and so on. And then we make an age pyramid looking at comparing all those cohorts. People have radically different likelihoods of dying or reproducing depending on their age. So a 10-year-old isn't going to produce any offspring, but a 30-year-old has a high likelihood of reproducing. And a 10-year-old is less likely to die than the 80-year-old. So if we can look at these different cohorts and how they're distributed in a population, it can tell us a lot about how many offspring there's going to be and how many people are going to die, etc. And we see that there are different age pyramids throughout the world. Countries vary tremendously in the age pyramids describing their population. So if two populations are the same size, you can have two that are the exact same size, but they can have different age distributions. Because they have different age distributions, despite being the same size population, they'll have very different features. On the right, we're seeing an example of Norway. So this is an example for industrialized countries. Most industrialized countries grow slowly or not at all. There are some countries even where there are a lot more old people than young people, and that becomes problematic at some point because they're not replacing themselves. In these countries, such as Norway, the age pyramid is more rectangular than pyramid-shaped, and that's because birth rates are low. So the bottom of the pyramid, where the young people are, it's not very wide. And because death rates are low, since humans live for so long in these countries, the higher age classes in the pyramid don't get significantly narrower, so the top. Instead, the cohorts remain about the same size all the way into the late 60s and 70s, at which point high mortality rates finally cause them to narrow. This gives the pyramid more or less rectangular shape. On the left is a more triangular shape, and it's seen in the age pyramid of developing countries, Kenya being an example. It has very high birth rates, reflected as a large base in the age pyramid. But they also have really high mortality rates, usually due to poor health care, causing a large and continuous reduction in the proportion of individuals in those older age groups, making it very narrow up there on top. So in these developing countries, most of the population is in the younger age group. Okay, so you can see this example in Kenya. Most individuals are 30 years old or younger, whereas over here in Norway, most individuals are spread all throughout, really. They can vary from about 15 all the way to 69 with the exact same distribution. So in Norway, people live longer because they don't have things that are killing them younger and younger, and they have less offspring. In Kenya, they're going to have things that cause them to die younger, and they have more offspring, which has interesting consequences for governments, economics, resources, all sorts of things. So know these two different age pyramids. An interesting example is the baby boom. The baby boom happened half a century ago, but young people today may end up paying a price for it. What exactly was it, and why does it still matter so much all these years later? What it is that beginning in the late 1940s, just after World War II, and continuing through the 1960s, families in the U.S. had many more babies than they had previously. So they had about a 30% increase of how many offspring there were per month. Okay, so we're having 30% more offspring than their parents had. Then the birth rate began to return to the earlier levels around the 1960s, and it's remained there ever since. As the babies from the baby boom years grew up, schools had to increase in size to accommodate all those children when they reached school age. But then the schools had to decrease in size once the baby boomers all graduated. So now as these individuals approach retirement age, the question of how their retirement and healthcare needs will be met is one of the biggest issues facing society. Because when you have a large population of people that are older and a relatively smaller population of younger people that are working and paying taxes, you can see how there's issues. And so there's a lot of underpinnings of these age pyramids with economics and politics. Here's a visual for you. So on the left, you're seeing the U.S. population in 1985. So remember that baby boom would have been the 50s and the 60s. So they're reaching about 18 to 20s, the baby boom generation in 1985. And then in the 2000s, you see them getting older. They're about 30s to 40s. And then 2015, last year, they were approaching retirement age. They're in their 60s. So you see a bulge in the age class of about 50 to 65 years old. So you see that moving up the age pyramid as time passes. So as baby boomers reach retirement, the population bulge may strain the Social Security system in the United States. This is why people are always talking about Social Security during debates. So age pyramids show the number of individuals in a population within any age group or cohort. How high can the human population actually go? Humans are a phenomenally successful species, very evolved. The numbers don't lie. There are more than 6 billion people alive today, and current birth rates exceed death rates by so much that we add 80 million more people to the total every single year. But for all of our success, the laws of physics and chemistry still apply. We all need food to eat for energy. We need space to live, right? We need a variety of other resources too, and we also need the capability of processing and storing all the waste products we generate. Because of these limits to perpetual population growth, we may, in fact, become victims of our own success. This we know for certain: human population growth cannot continue forever at the current rate. Like every other species, our environment has a carrying capacity. Remember I talked about that carrying capacity? And beyond that carrying capacity, populations cannot be maintained. So how high can that carrying capacity go? What is our carrying capacity? Unfortunately, it's a difficult question to answer, although not for lack of trying. For more than 300 years, biologists have been making estimates. One estimate in the 1700s that our carrying capacity would be just over 13 billion people. The median of all the old as well as the new estimates is just over 10 billion. And the United Nations conservatively suggests it is somewhere between 7 and 11 billion. We're already at 7. But the growth of populations doesn't always appear as a smooth S-shaped logistic growth curve. Remember we showed you that logistic growth curve where you have exponential growth and the carrying capacity pushes it into that S shape. For some populations like humans, the carrying capacity of an environment is not set in stone. It keeps increasing. Here's an example of why. In 1983, an acre of farmland produced an average of 11.5 bushels of corn. So 1983. But by 1933, 50 years later, that was up from 11.5 to 19.5 bushels per acre. And then in 1992, it had increased to 95 bushels per acre. So within approximately 100 years, we went from 11.5 to 95 bushels per acre. So we're getting really good at getting more food from a small area. How did that happen? Well, the development of several agricultural technologies. So that includes the use of different types of corn, different types of fertilizer, doing crop rotations, managing pests well, all sorts of stuff. So all those things made it possible to produce more and more food from the same amount of land. And that's just one example of how the carrying capacity of an environment can be increased for humans. We kind of have control over our environment to an extent, but there is absolutely carrying capacity. Every species has a carrying capacity. And because ours has gone up, it's very likely that it has decreased for many other species that were trying to live in the same environments as humans and their crops. It's the unfortunate downside. Again, trying to figure out the carrying capacity, there's large variation from one biologist to the next, and it's hard to figure out. But it's pretty important to know so that we can work to avoid a global catastrophe where we have way too many people and not enough resources. The problem, it seems, goes back to the reasons behind the tremendous human excess in the first place, of why we can't estimate it. We're so clever that we appear to keep increasing the carrying capacity before we ever bump into it. We do this in a variety of ways, all made possible by various technologies that we invent. In particular, the three that you should know is 1, we expand into new habitats. So with fire, tools, shelter, and efficient food distribution, we can survive almost anywhere on Earth now. Number 2, we increase the agricultural productivity of the land. We just went through that example. Number 3, we circumvent the problems that usually accompany life at higher density. Problems at higher density should be public health and civil engineering, but we have advances in that. And those advances make it possible for higher and higher densities of people to live together with minimal problems from waste and infectious disease. I have visited Europe many times, and I've been to really densely populated cities there in several different countries, and the way that they use their space is very different than here in the Midwest because they have to be a lot more conservative with their space, which makes sense. So as densities increase, you're going to think about all of those engineering issues and space issues. But how high can the population go? I mean, really. The most difficult problem in determining the Earth's carrying capacity for humans is assessing just how many resources each person needs. It is possible to estimate the ecological footprint. We've talked about that before. Of an individual, you could go figure out yours online actually, or even an entire country by evaluating how much land, food, water, and fuel that are used. This method reveals that although some countries like New Zealand, Canada, and Sweden have more resources available than are required to support the needs of the population, resource use in the world as a whole is significantly greater than the resources available. So that's implying that we are already at our planet's carrying capacity for using more resources that are available. The populations of many countries, including the United States, Japan, Germany, England, they currently consume unsustainable levels of resources. So even though some countries don't consume all the resources, we still consume so much that overall we're consuming more than is available. This is a really important issue. So determining the carrying capacity, very important. We must be more specific when we ask how high it can go. We must add and at what level of comfort, security, and stability, and with what impact on the other species on Earth are we willing to affect to raise that carrying capacity ever higher. Because there are trade-offs. Alright, what has allowed humans to avoid reaching carrying capacity in the past? The answer is number 5. We talked about all those examples 1 through 4 as being things humans use. And just think about it, like common sense wise. We've expanded into different habitats. We can live almost anywhere. We've increased our agricultural productivity, our healthcare, and our sanitation. The world's human population is currently growing at a very high rate. We're over 6 billion, and the United Nations says that the Earth's carrying capacity for humans is a population size between 7 and 11 billion. Kind of disheartening news. Chapter 15, we're still talking about ecology, but instead of populations, we're now going to focus on ecosystems and communities. So not just groups of organisms that are the same species, but now we're going to include communities of other species as well as environments with those non-living things. You're responsible for sections 1 through 2, 6, 8 through 10, and 12 through 14. You should know the different types of biomes, how chemicals and energy move through ecosystems, how species interact. In this figure, there are living components of the flamingos. There's also other little birds you can see in there. There's definitely fish, there's plants under the water, and then there's non-living components like the water itself or rocks. So remember that ecosystems is not just a community of living things, but it's a community of living things plus those non-living components. We call the living parts of an ecosystem biotic, and we call those non-living parts, those physical things, abiotic. The abiotic environment consists of all the living things within an area, and that part is usually the community. And then the abiotic environment refers to the organism's habitat, which consists of the chemical resources of the soil, water, and air, such as like carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus. And then it also includes the physical conditions, such as the temperature. Biologists view communities of organisms and their habitats, so these biotic and abiotic things, as systems, in much the same way that engineers might. So that's why we call it an ecosystem. Biologists monitor the inputs and outputs of the system. They can trace the flow of energy and various molecules as they are captured, transformed, and utilized by organisms and later exit the system or are recycled. So regardless of the size of the ecosystem, the same principles of an ecosystem apply. You can observe and analyze organisms in their environment while monitoring everything that goes into and comes out of the system. So an ecosystem doesn't have to be huge. It can be any size as long as it's a community of living organisms, biotic things with abiotic things. So imagine that you have a lush nature scene. Got some greenery. You might have like a log in there and abundant wildlife. There's some grazing deer. Maybe there's some predators that feed on other animals and their eggs. There's parasites looking for hosts. And below the surface, scavengers find meals among the organic detritus. But now imagine that entire scene gets up and walks away. Alright, so that whole scene that we were imagining got up and walked away, and the camera in your mind pulls back to reveal the entire scene is playing out in the back of a beetle, no more than 2 inches long. The host of this mini ecosystem is a beetle from New Guinea called the weevil. The weevil is camouflaged from its predators by lichen, which is a combination of fungus and photosynthetic algae living together. And the lichens are given a safe surface to live on top of the weevil. And the garden of lichen supports a wide range of other organisms, from tiny mites to a variety of other microscopic invertebrates, some free-living and some parasites. So which of the following is an abiotic component of the ecosystem on the body of a large weevil? Pause the video if you need to. The answer is number 1. Remember, abiotic is non-living things. Sunlight, obviously not alive. This is just redefining what an ecosystem is, and that you can find them in obvious and not so obvious places. Biomes are what we're going to talk about now. They cover huge geographic areas of land or water. For example, the deserts that stretch almost all the way across the northern part of Africa. There are terrestrial, which means land, biomes. They're defined and usually described by the predominant types of plant life in the area. But looking at a map of the world's terrestrial biomes, it is clear that they are mostly determined by the weather. Specifically, when defining terrestrial biomes, we ask 4 questions about the weather. One is, what is the average temperature? We also say, what is the average rainfall? You might hear the word precipitation instead of rainfall. What is the temperature is the temperature relatively constant, or does it vary seasonally? Right? Is it like warm all year round, or is it like here in the Midwest where it's cold and really hot, depending on what time of the year it is? And lastly, is the rainfall relatively constant, or does it vary seasonally? For example, where it is always moist and the temperature does not vary across the season, you will find tropical rainforests. And where it is hot, but with strong seasonality that brings a wet season and a dry season, you'll see savannas or tropical seasonal forests develop. If we look at the other end of the spectrum of precipitation, so if we look in dry areas that have a hot season and a cold season, there's temperate grasslands or deserts developing. So there are 9 chief terrestrial biomes. All are determined mostly by precipitation and temperature levels throughout the year. So you should know some of the qualities of these different terrestrial biomes. It's also aquatic biomes. They are defined a bit differently, usually based on physical features such as salinity, meaning how much salt there is, on water movement, and on depth. Chief among the environments that you should know is number 1, lakes and ponds, because they have non-flowing fresh water. Number 2 is rivers and streams, which are freshwater but they're flowing. Number 3 is estuaries and wetlands, where salt water and freshwater mix. It's in a shallow region characterized by exceptionally high productivity. And then number 4, you have open oceans with deep salt water. And then coral reefs, which are highly diverse and productive regions in shallow ocean. Alright, so you're probably going to go back to the chart to answer this question. The answer is number 4. Alright, biomes are the major ecological communities of Earth, characterized mostly by vegetation. That's because the vegetation is going to be dictated, though, by the temperature and the amount of precipitation in the case of terrestrial biomes. All life on Earth is made possible because energy flows perpetually from the sun to the Earth. So remember when we talked about photosynthesis and photons and respiration? It's all coming back around. The sun is where a pathway of energy flow begins, as I've taught you before. Most of the energy is absorbed or reflected by the Earth's atmosphere surface, but about 1% of it, remember that, only 1% of the sunlight is intercepted and converted to chemical energy through the process of photosynthesis. That intercepted energy is then transformed again and again by living organisms, making 4 stops as it passes through an ecosystem. Let's examine what happens at each stop, known as the trophic levels. The first stop is the primary producers. When it comes to energy flow, all the species in an ecosystem can be placed in one of 2 groups: producers or consumers. Plants, along with some bacteria, are the primary producers. That means they convert light energy from the sun into chemical energy through that process of photosynthesis. The second stop, these are the primary consumers, the herbivores. For example, cattle grazing in a field. Most herbivores are animals that eat plants. They need a little help in digesting the plants they eat. The third stop is secondary consumers, which are carnivores. So energy originating from the sun is converted into chemical energy within a plant's tissue, and then the herbivores that eats the plant breaks down that chemical bond, releasing the energy, and then this energy fuels the herbivore's growth, reproduction, and movement, but it doesn't remain in the herbivore forever because carnivores, such as cats for example, feed on the herbivores. Those are secondary consumers. The fourth stop, tertiary consumers, or the top carnivores. In some ecosystems, energy makes yet another stop at the top carnivores, which are the animals that eat the animals that eat the animals that eat the plants. Because there's so many steps removed from the initial capture of solar energy by the plant, a lot of energy is lost, which we'll talk about. Top carnivores, such as an eagle or a great white shark, they consume other carnivores. They break down their tissue for their energy. You may have learned about the food chain, but what we really prefer to talk about when we actually talk about as biologists is the food web. That's what that box near the bottom is showing you. There's one guy we haven't talked about yet, and that is the Earth's recyclers. In every ecosystem, as energy is transformed through the steps of that food web, organic material accumulates in the form of animal waste, pretty much poop, as well as dead animals and plants. That's where Earth's recyclers come in. They are decomposers. You should definitely know what a decomposer is. Decomposers are usually bacteria or fungus, and they are also called detritivores. This also includes scavengers such as vultures and worms, for example, and some arthropods like this beetle shown here. What their job is that they break down the organic material from all of that animal waste and the dead creatures, and they harvest energy still stored in that material. Because the decomposers are able to break down a much larger range of organic molecules, they are able to use a lot of things as resources. We talked about this some, how energy is going, when energy goes from one process to another, heat is released. And we talked about those laws of thermodynamics. So energy flows from one stop to the next in that food web, but it's not like in the way that runners pass a baton in a relay race. The difference is that every step in the food web, much of the usable energy is lost as heat. So majority is lost as heat. So an animal that eats 5 pounds of plant material, those herbivores as primary consumers, let's say they eat 5 pounds of producers, that doesn't necessarily convert into 5 new pounds of body weight. Right? Think about how much you eat every day. You don't put all that weight directly onto you. So in the next section, we'll see how this inefficiency of energy transfer ensures that food webs are very short. Alright, since the majority of energy is released as heat, it's actually 90% that's released, and only 10% goes into making biomass. Biomass is the total weight of all living organisms in a given area. So only 10% of the biomass of plants in an ecosystem is converted into herbivore biomass. So we start with the sun energy. Only 1% of that gets through to those producers. And then those producers only transfer 10% of that onto the primary consumers. So the herbivore consuming 5 pounds of plant material is likely to gain only about half a pound in new growth, while the remaining 90% of the meal is either expended in that cellular respiration process or lost as feces and heat. Similarly, a carnivore eating the herbivore converts only about 10% of the mass it consumes into its own body mass. Again, 90% is lost to metabolism and feces. So that inefficiency of losing 90% every single time holds for the top carnivores as well. It's because of that 10% rule that limits the length of the food webs, and it's responsible for the rarity of big, fierce animals, those top carnivores. They're not very common because they're not very energy efficient. We can illustrate the path of the energy to talk about those top consumers with an energy pyramid. So each layer of the pyramid represents a biomass of a certain level. We can see that for terrestrial ecosystems, the biomass, we're showing that in kilograms per square meter, found in photosynthetic organisms is at the base of the pyramid, and that it reduces significantly at each step up that food web. Go ahead and answer this. The answer is number 5. So know about those different trophic levels we talked about, from the producers to those different consumers, and about the 10% rule. You should know about the herbivores, the carnivores, the top carnivores, the decomposers. Chemicals are essential for life. Chemicals are pretty important. We've talked about them. New energy is continually coming to Earth from the sun, and everything else is already here on Earth. It just keeps getting recycled around and around and around. Plants and other producers generally take up the molecules from the atmosphere or the soil that they need, and then those chemicals move into animals as they consume plants, or further on as animals consume other animals. So as the plants and animals die, the decomposers then return the chemicals to the abiotic environment, and it's just recycling of molecules over and over. That's why keeping those chemicals that we need to live pristine and around is really important. Chemicals cycle through the living and non-living components of an ecosystem. Each chemical is stored in a non-living and abiotic part of the environment called a reservoir. And organisms acquire the chemical from the reservoir, and the chemical cycles through the food chain, and eventually it returns to the reservoir. The three most important chemicals that cycle that we all need is carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. We won't go through all three of them in depth, but we will talk about carbon. It's largely found in 4 compartments on Earth. There are large reservoirs in the ocean, in the atmosphere, terrestrial organisms, and fossil deposits. Plants and other photosynthetic organisms obtain most of their carbon from the atmosphere, where carbon is in the form of carbon dioxide, of course. So remember, photosynthesis, those producers take in that carbon dioxide. That's their main source of carbon. So that was back in chapter 4. We talked about that. Remember, plants and some microorganisms use carbon dioxide in photosynthesis. And then they separate the carbon molecules to build sugars. And then that carbon then moves into the sugars and then through the food chain as organisms eat plants and then are eaten themselves by carnivores. The oceans contain most of the Earth's carbon, though. Many organisms use dissolved carbon in the oceans to build shells. Most carbon returns to its reservoir as a consequence of organisms' metabolic processes. So organisms extract energy from food by breaking those carbon-carbon bonds in the sugar, and they release the energy stored in the bonds and combine the released carbon atoms with oxygen. That's why we exhale CO2. So it returns back. CO2 is taken in from the atmosphere by plants, and it's put back into the atmosphere by all the consumers. So just recycled around. Fossil fuels are another reservoir. They're created when large numbers of organisms die and are buried in rocks that lack oxygen. And because there's no oxygen around and there's high pressure, after very, very long periods of time, the organic remains are ultimately transformed into coal, oil, and natural gas. So those are our fossil fuels: coal, oil, and natural gas. That is trapped dead organisms over a really long period of time in rock. So these sources of carbon, these fossil fuels, play a little role in the global carbon cycle. They're pretty small reservoirs compared to the atmosphere of the oceans, but humans in industrialized countries began using fossil fuels to power various technologies, so they became pretty important. So burning coal, oil, and natural gas releases large amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, but it didn't come out of the atmosphere reservoir. So we are increasing the amount of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that was never there to begin with. So it increases the average CO2, carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. So the current level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is the highest it has been in almost 500,000 years. This has potentially disastrous implications. We'll talk about that in the next chapter. Global carbon dioxide levels are rising overall, but they also exhibit a sharp rise and fall over the course of the year. And why might that be? Take a second to think about it. You can probably come up with an answer. So on average, the level of carbon dioxide in the environment is increasing because we're taking it from fossil fuels and putting it in the atmosphere, but there is rises in fluctuations due to the ability of plants to absorb carbon dioxide. So many trees, right, they lose their leaves each fall, and during the winter months, relatively low rates of photosynthesis are happening because photosynthesis primarily happens in leaves. And then you have lower rates of carbon dioxide consumption, causing an annual peak in atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. So you'd have more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere during winter. But then in the summer, when those leaves are present and the sunlight is really strong and coming through, you're going to have consumption of carbon dioxide, causing a drop in the atmospheric carbon dioxide level. So overall the average is rising, but there are always fluctuations up and down. Another important one is the nitrogen cycle, because nitrogen is necessary to build all those amino acids that we need for proteins. It's also a precursor of other nitrogen-containing molecules critical to life. So like carbon, the chief reservoir of nitrogen is the atmosphere, but even though more than 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen gas, for most organisms the nitrogen is unusable. So the problem is that atmospheric nitrogen consists of two nitrogen atoms bonded tightly together, so they're covalently bonded, and those bonds need to be broken to make the nitrogen usable for all living organisms. There are some soil-dwelling bacteria that are nitrogen fixers, though. So these bacteria are important for all life on Earth to get their nitrogen. These bacteria convert, or we say fix, the nitrogen by attaching it to other atoms, including hydrogen, that produces things like ammonia and other compounds, that those compounds can then be further modified by other bacteria into a form that ultimately can be taken up by plants and used to build proteins. Once nitrogen is in plant tissues, animals acquire it in the same way they acquire that carbon. That's by eating those plants. And then nitrogen returns to the atmosphere when animal wastes and dead animals are broken down by other bacteria in the soil that convert the nitrogen compounds in those tissues back to nitrogen gas. So that's how it cycles around. So bacteria are very in the soil are very important for the nitrogen cycle, but not necessarily the carbon cycle. So we talked about how humans are increasing the atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. So here's another example of humans causing some environmental changes. Eutrophication is the increase in nutrients in an ecosystem, especially nitrogen, also phosphorus, but we've been talking about nitrogen. Because there's more nitrogen than there should be around, you get a boom in things that can fix nitrogen. Remember those nitrogen-fixing bacteria? They're in the soil, but they're also in aquatic ecosystems too. So when you have a lot of food available, you're going to have a big boom in all of that bacteria that can eat it, the nitrogen, and then those are alive and consuming oxygen to survive, and the oxygen is then not available in those lakes for fish and other organisms, and they die off. So the process of excess nutrients leads to the rapid growth of algae and bacteria, followed by large-scale die-offs. Where does the nitrogen, how does it come from? Like, where is it coming from to get into the lakes like that? It's often a limiting resource, nitrogen, in the context of soil. Remember, most of it's in the atmosphere. But fertilizers contain large amounts of phosphorus and nitrogen, which is beneficial in the short run when we're growing our crops, but it has unintended consequences. So as it is added to the soil, some of it runs off with the water and ends up in lakes and ponds and rivers. And that's where it's getting fixed by all of these nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And then those nitrogen-fixing bacteria, boom, use all the oxygen, and other animals die off. So chemical fertilizers are number 5. They cause eutrophication, we just talked about. How do they cause that? Well, they provide additional nitrogen for crops and phosphorus as well. We talked about chemicals essential to life, carbon, nitrogen, also phosphorus when we talk about it, but it also cycles through ecosystems, and that these cycles can be disrupted as human activities increase the amount of chemicals in the environment, and we disproportionately put them in places where they normally are not, like the carbon dioxide and the nitrogen example in the lakes. Last thing, we'll talk about species interactions, how they can influence the structure of communities. Each species role in a community is defined by its niche. Some people say niche, I say niche. Just like in a society, most humans need to find their niche or their clique. Each person plays a particular role defined by the nature of his or her work, activities, interactions with others. Other species do the same thing within their communities, which are geographic areas defined as loose groupings of species. Each species has its own niche. We can think of an organism's niche as its place in the community, but there's more than just a place for living, it's a complete way of living. In other words, an organism's niche encompasses 1, the space it requires, also the type and amount of food it consumes. It includes the timing of its reproduction, that's its life history, remember, and also its temperature and moisture requirements, and virtually every other aspect that describes the way the organism uses its environment. So you should know those niche features. And I just want to point out, animals adapt through natural selection and eventually evolve to fit a niche, but some animals adapting can also cause other animals to adapt too, and then those species evolve together. So here we see the hummingbird has adapted to get nectar out of a flower, and the flower at the same time has adapted to be more and more accessible to hummingbirds to get out nectar. Remember, we talked about natural selection, coming back again. Remember how natural selection causes organisms to become better adapted to their environment? So as long as there is a variation for a trait, and that trait is heritable, going back to genetics, heritability, chapter 7, you have differential reproductive success, and that leads to changes in the population. So it's easy to imagine populations becoming more and more efficient at utilizing these non-living resources, like chemicals we've been talking about, like nitrogen. Natural selection does not distinguish between biotic and abiotic resources as selective forces. Either one can cause evolution. Alright, so you've all heard about the predator-prey relationship. Predation is defined as an interaction between two species in which one species eats the other. An example of predation on humans could be mosquitoes. So every year, more than 1 million humans die as a result of mosquito bites, compared with fewer than a dozen from shark attacks. So which one should we define as a predator? Prey have adapted defenses. There are, to avoid predation, there are physical defenses, like physical structures, which there are quills on this porcupine, toxins on the skin of these poison dart frogs, coloration that says, hey, you don't want to eat me, stay away, or even camouflage so the predator can't see the prey in the first place. There's also behavioral defenses, in addition to those physical ones, that prey utilize to avoid predation: hiding and escaping. For example, a variation of that would be safety in numbers, shown here with these fish. Also alarm calling, warning, and fighting back. What this bird is doing to fight back is its projectile vomiting at the predator to keep it away. It's an interesting evolution there. Predators adapt too, so if the prey adapts, the predator is going to evolve and adapt back. The example here is an anglerfish. So predators can use physical and behavioral features as well. And this example with the anglerfish is mimicry. This little thing on its head looks like food to stuff. It mimics a food item of interest to little fishies. And as those fish come closer to inspect it and maybe try and eat it because they think it's food, the predator would snap it up. So you can pretty much think of predators and prey as an evolutionary arms race. Again, evolution is not a linear thing. Mutations just arise, and then they're heritable traits. And if they give you an adaptation that makes you reproduce more than others, you're going to keep surviving. So as prey have adaptations that naturally arise that have them adapt, predators will have adaptations in response, and back and forth and back and forth. I I've talked about parasitism before. It is a form of predation. So parasites are predators that benefit from a relationship with hosts specifically. There's different types of parasites. They can be ectoparasites, like this bed bug. They live outside their host, like on the skin. Lice would be another example. And then there's endoparasites, which would live inside the body, like malaria or Trypanosoma brucei. They're inside the human host. And parasites don't get talked about a lot in biology class, but they're really abundant. They may be 3 to 4 times as many parasitic species as non-parasitic species on Earth. Parasites, I think, are very fascinating because they face some unusual challenges, particularly how do they get from one host to another? They can't walk. How do they live inside the host and adapt to it? So they have some interesting adaptations that have evolved. Not all species interactions are negative, though. It's not just all predator-prey. There's also a thing called mutualism and commensalism. You should know about those. Mutualism is where both species benefit from an interaction. So the example here is a swamp flower that's being pollinated by a bumblebee. So the bumblebee gets some food from the flower, delicious nectar that it can eat as its food source. But the flower is benefiting too because the pollen gets carried from that bumblebee from flower to flower. And we'll talk about this in chapters 17 through 19. Flowers reproduce by getting their pollen transferred from one plant to another. Commensalism, it's an interaction with when one species benefits. The other one doesn't benefit necessarily, but it's not at a disadvantage either. So one has a benefit and the other one is neutral. So here we have this bird, an egret, which is feeding on insects stirred up by the grazing buffalo. So the buffalo isn't really getting a benefit. It's neither help nor harm, but the bird is definitely getting a benefit of a free meal. So know the definition of those two as well. I think I'm going to stop there because this lecture is already gone an hour, which is the normal length of time. So we will pick up chapter 16 next week. So you don't need to know those until next week.